August in Augusta, Georgia felt like being wrapped in a hot, wet blanket. The air was so thick it was hard to breathe. Above the street, you could see heat waves rising from the road. The sun was going down over the Savannah River, painting the sky beautiful colors of peach and purple that people in Georgia say look like God's own painting. It was the summer of 1990, and two 15-year-old twin sisters, Danette and Jeanette Holloway, were counting down the last weeks before starting 10th grade at Glen Hills High School. The sisters walked out of Morrison's family restaurant just after 8:00 in the evening on August 14th. They had their matching jean jackets tied around their waists. Their sneakers scraped against the sidewalk as they laughed about something only twins can understand. A security camera at Morrison's, the video was fuzzy and unclear, but it was kept in the Richmond County evidence room for 30 years, caught their last moments inside the restaurant. Danette pushed through the glass door first. Her hair was pulled back in a high ponytail that bounced when she moved. Jeanette followed 3 steps behind, fixing the strap of her backpack. Her identical ponytail caught the last rays of sunlight. They had spent their evening shift clearing tables and refilling sweet tea for dinner customers. Their pockets were full of tip money that they planned to use for new school clothes. The walk home should have taken them exactly 18 minutes along a path they had walked hundreds of times before. They would go down Broad Street, past the Rexall Pharmacy, then turn left onto Hickman Road. They would walk through a neighborhood where porch lights glowed yellow and children's bikes lay on front lawns. Then they would go 6 blocks east to the small brick house where their mother would be, waiting with leftover peach cobbler and questions about their work shift. But somewhere between Morrison's glass door and their front porch, Danette and Jeanette Holloway disappeared completely. It was as if the hot Georgia night had swallowed them whole. No one heard any screams in the quiet evening. No one saw any signs of a struggle that might have disturbed the fireflies dancing above the neat lawns. No one saw anything unusual except for a dark-colored car, no one knew what kind, sitting near the corner of Broad and Hickman around 8:15. By 9:30, when neither daughter had walked through the door or called to explain why they were late, Evelyn Holloway felt the first terrible feeling of fear run down her back. By 10:00, she had driven their route twice, looking into the growing darkness, her headlights cutting through the summer haze. By 11, her voice was rough from calling their names, and her hands shook as she called the Richmond County Sheriff's Department to report what her mother's instinct already knew for certain. 2 15-year-old girls had disappeared from a safe neighborhood in less time than it takes to walk home from work. The distance from Morrison's restaurant to the Holloway home was exactly 1.2 miles. Somewhere along that familiar path in those 18 minutes that should have been ordinary, something had turned a normal Tuesday evening into the beginning of Augusta's longest nightmare. What made the disappearance truly impossible to understand was not just the lack of clues, but that it made no sense at all. The twins were always together, looking identical, but different enough in personality that friends could tell them apart within seconds of talking to them. Danette, older by 4 minutes, was quietly confident and dreamed of studying law at Spelman College. Jeanette, more outgoing and spontaneous, wanted to be an animal doctor and filled notebooks with drawings of animals she hoped to save someday. Neither girl had a boyfriend who might make them do something reckless. Neither had said anything about wanting to run away or hinted at problems that would make disappearing seem like an answer. The first search brought Augusta together with the strong care that Southern communities show when one of their own goes missing. Within hours of Evelyn's call, neighbors formed search groups that looked through every inch of their route. Flashlights bobbed through the darkness like stars on Earth as volunteers checked empty buildings, drainage ditches, and wooded areas behind the strip mall on Broad Street. The First Baptist Church on Walton Way opened its meeting hall as a command center. By sunrise on August 15th, over 300 people had gathered to organize the largest civilian search Richmond County had seen in decades. Sheriff's deputies talked to everyone who had been at Morrison's that evening. The restaurant manager confirmed the twins had clocked out at 8:07. A regular customer remembered Danette bringing his check around 7:50, her smile bright even though she was tired from a long shift. The cook remembered Jeanette asking if she could take home leftover cornbread for their younger brother Marcus. Every detail showed 2 teenagers finishing a normal workday, ready to go home. The dark car reported near Broad and Hickman became the investigation's first clue to follow. 3 witnesses mentioned seeing it, though they described it in different ways. An older woman walking her small dog thought it was a Chevrolet, maybe dark blue or black. A teenager smoking on his front porch was sure it was a Ford, definitely black with dark windows. The pharmacist closing up the Rexall remembered a dark vehicle, possibly burgundy, but couldn't promise what make or model. What all three agreed on was the time, around 8:15, and the behavior. The car was stopped but running, as if waiting for something or someone. The Richmond County Sheriff's Department made a list of every dark car registered in Augusta and nearby counties. 473 vehicles. Deputies began the tiring job of finding each owner, checking alibis, and looking for any connection to the Holloway family or Morrison's restaurant. The investigation used every available resource, but with each passing hour, the chance of finding the girls alive got smaller and smaller. By the third day, FBI agents had come to Augusta, their federal resources and skills joining local efforts. They talked to the twins' classmates, looked through their bedroom for clues about how they were feeling, and checked their school lockers for any hint of secret relationships or hidden troubles. What they found was heartbreakingly normal. Homework finished in neat handwriting, posters of New Edition and Janet Jackson on the walls, a shared diary where the sisters wrote ordinary teenage thoughts about classes, friends, and their dreams for the future. The last entry, dated August 13th, said simply, "One more year until we can get our licenses. Freedom is coming." The search grew to cover areas far beyond their walking route. Volunteers waded through creek beds and searched the banks of the Savannah River. Helicopters with heat-sensing cameras flew in patterns over Richmond County, but their technology was useless against the passage of time and the thick cover of Georgia pine trees. Tracking dogs followed scent trails that ended suddenly at the curb on Hickman Road, suggesting the twins had been put in a vehicle. As August turned into September with no breakthrough, no ransom demand, and no bodies discovered, Augusta began the painful process of accepting something they couldn't accept. Two bright, beloved daughters of their community had simply stopped existing somewhere between a restaurant's glass door and a mother's front porch. The search efforts continued, but hope changed into the sad determination to at least find remains to give the family closure instead of answers. For 33 years, the question would haunt everyone who knew their names. What happened to Danette and Jeanette Holloway during those 18 minutes? The answer lay hidden closer than anyone imagined, buried not in the earth but in plain sight, kept secret by a man who would walk among them for decades. His terrible secret hidden behind a smile that fooled an entire city. Before we continue deeper into this case that shook Georgia, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. These stories connect us across distances, reminding us that the search for truth and justice has no boundaries. Disappearance of the Holloway twins marked the end of Augusta's innocence, the moment when doors that had never needed locks were locked tight, when parents who had let their children roam freely began tracking their every movement, when a community that was proud of its neighborly trust learned that evil doesn't always announce itself with clear warning signs. And somewhere in that hot Georgia night, a predator had taken 2 lives and would spend the next 30 years living as if nothing had changed, attending the very vigils held in the twins' memory, offering sympathy to a mother whose grief he had caused. The case would go cold, buried under newer cases and limited resources, filed away in a basement where dust gathered on boxes labeled Holloway, Danette and Jeanette 1990. But the story doesn't end in that basement. It ends 30 years later with a discovery so shocking it would force Augusta to face an uncomfortable truth about the monsters who hide in plain sight and the power of science to finally give voice to victims who had been silenced for far too long. The Richmond County Sheriff's Department in 1990 was a capable but understaffed agency serving a population of nearly 200,000, spread across city Augusta and the surrounding countryside. Sheriff Roland Patterson, a 30-year veteran known more for his political skills than investigative innovation, found himself thrown into the most high-profile case of his career, with limited resources and experience mostly with routine crimes. The investigation into the Holloway twins' disappearance began with careful determination, but quickly ran into the limitations that would trouble it for years. Lead Detective Frank Morrison, a thin man with 22 years on the force, organized efforts from a cramped office where maps of Augusta covered every wall. Red pins marked the twins' last known location at Morrison's restaurant. Blue pins traced their intended route home. Yellow pins showed areas searched. But the map showed more questions than answers. A map of absence where 2 teenagers had simply stopped existing. The dark car sightings took up the first weeks of investigation. Deputies tracked down every registered vehicle matching the vague descriptions, talking to owners from early morning until well past midnight. The process found 3 people of interest who would stay under watch for months. Each eventually cleared but never entirely forgotten by investigators who understood that absence of proof isn't proof of absence. Marcus Delacqua, a 41-year-old delivery driver for a medical supply company, owned a dark blue Chevrolet Caprice that matched one witness's description. He had no connection to the Holloway family and no criminal record except for a speeding ticket from 1987. His route log showed deliveries in Augusta on August 14th, but the timing was unclear. He said he finished his shift at 7:30 and drove straight home to his apartment on the south side of town. His landlady thought she heard him arrive around 8 but couldn't be sure. Without evidence to prove his account was wrong, detectives had to release him, though his name stayed in the active file. Jerome Williams, a 28-year-old construction foreman, drove a black Ford Taurus and had been seen near Morrison's restaurant multiple times. Williams had hired seasonal workers from the neighborhood and knew several families on Hickman Road, though not the Holloways directly. More concerning was his history. A domestic violence arrest from 1988, where charges were dropped when his girlfriend refused to testify. Williams had no alibi for the evening of August 14th, claiming he was home alone watching television. Lie detector test results were unclear. Detectives searched his vehicle and found nothing suspicious, but Williams' bad temper and closeness to the area kept him on the suspect list. The third person of interest came from an unexpected direction. Robert Chen, a 35-year-old photographer who ran a small portrait studio on Broad Street 3 blocks from Morrison's, drove a burgundy Oldsmobile sedan. Chen had photographed the Holloway twins for their school portraits the previous spring and had told colleagues that they were particularly photogenic. When questioned, Chen became defensive, insisting his professional interest was being misunderstood. He had been at his studio until 8:30 on August 14th, developing photographs in his dark room, alone and unable to prove it. A search of his studio found nothing suspicious except for the uncomfortable fact that he had kept copies of the twins' portrait proofs, something he said was standard practice but which made investigators very uneasy. All 3 men answered questions, took lie detector tests, and had their vehicles searched. All 3 stayed free because suspicion, however strong, isn't evidence. The frustration of having possible suspects but no way to clear them or charge them ate at Detective Morrison. Years later, he would tell a reporter, "I knew one of those men probably held the answer." But knowing and proving are different universes in law enforcement. As fall arrived and school started without Danette and Jeanette in their seats at Glen Hills High School, the case began its slow drift toward the cold case files. The FBI reduced its involvement as other emergencies needed attention. Local news coverage shifted from daily updates to weekly features to occasional anniversary pieces. The volunteer search parties that had numbered in the hundreds shrank to a dedicated core of family, friends and church members who refused to give up hope. For Evelyn Holloway, the mother who had reported her daughters missing, the investigation's gradual slowdown felt like a second loss equally terrible as the first. A 38-year-old nurse at University Hospital, Evelyn had raised her 3 children alone after her husband's death from a heart attack when the twins were just 7. She had worked double shifts to provide stability and opportunity, believing that hard work and faith would protect her family from the worst of what the world could offer. The twins' disappearance shattered that belief with brutal finality. In the weeks following August 14th, Evelyn transformed her small brick house into an informal command center that would stay operational for 30 years. The dining room table disappeared beneath maps, flyers, and binders containing every piece of information about the case. A second phone line was installed, its number printed on missing person posters that Evelyn printed at her own cost and distributed throughout Georgia and neighboring states. The walls of what had been the twins' shared bedroom became a shrine where Evelyn kept every detail exactly as they had left it, from the unmade beds to the textbooks open to pages they would never finish reading. Marcus Holloway, 13 years old when his sisters vanished, watched his mother's transformation with a mix of admiration and worry. Where grief might have broken another person, It seemed to forge Evelyn into something harder, more focused, more determined to get meaning from tragedy. She attended every town hall meeting about community safety. She testified before the Georgia legislature about the need for faster response rules in missing persons cases. She started a support group for families of the missing that met monthly at First Baptist Church, providing comfort to others going through similar nightmares. But Marcus also saw the cost of this transformation. His mother slept maybe 4 hours a night. The rest spent looking through case files or making calls to law enforcement agencies across the Southeast. She aged 10 years in a single year, her hair going gray, her face developing deep lines that hadn't existed before August 14th. She kept the twins' bedroom with religious devotion, changing the sheets weekly, dusting furniture that no one used, keeping the space ready for a homecoming she must have known deep down would never happen. The Holloway case suffered from the same limitations that troubled many investigations from that time. Forensic capabilities in 1990 were basic compared to what would come in later decades. DNA analysis existed but was expensive and time-consuming, used mainly in cases where there was physical evidence to test. The Holloway investigation had no crime scene, no bodies, no items that might contain the genetic material that would revolutionize criminal justice within a few years. Security camera coverage was rare in 1990. Beyond the single camera at Morrison's restaurant that caught the twins leaving work, there was no visual record of their movements. The route they walked home went through residential neighborhoods where cameras were rarities, considered unnecessary in areas where everyone knew everyone, and crime was something that happened somewhere else. The investigation created thousands of pages of reports, witness statements, and follow-up notes, but quantity couldn't make up for the absence of the crucial physical evidence that might have turned suspicion into certainty. Detective Morrison kept working the case even as other investigations needed his attention, making calls on his own time, following up on tips that continued to come in from across the country, each one requiring investigation despite the shrinking chance of being relevant. The case officially went cold in 1993, though it was never formally closed. The label simply meant that active daily investigation stopped, replaced by periodic reviews and responses to new information. The file boxes moved to the evidence storage facility in the basement of the Richmond County Courthouse, where they would sit undisturbed for years, waiting for technology and circumstance to finally come together in pursuit of justice delayed but not denied. Time moves differently for families of the missing. While Augusta changed around them, transforming from a mid-sized southern city into a sprawling metropolitan area, the Holloway household stayed frozen in August 1990. The calendar on the kitchen wall stayed turned to that month for 3 years before Evelyn finally let Marcus change it. And even then, she circled the 14th in red marker every month, a permanent reminder of the day her world split in two. The 1990s brought changes that made the twins' disappearance feel increasingly distant to everyone except those who carried the grief. Morrison's family restaurant closed in 1995, replaced by a chain drugstore whose employees knew nothing of the history in that location. The neighborhood along Hickman Road saw gradual change as original residents retired to Florida or passed away, replaced by families who had never heard the Holloway name. Glen Hills High School renovated its buildings and updated its records, and eventually the twins' yearbook photos became artifacts of an era rather than reminders of an ongoing tragedy. Detective Frank Morrison retired in 1998 with the Holloway case still listed among his unsolved files. At his retirement party, colleagues noticed he spent more time talking about the missing twins than celebrating his own career. He kept copies of the case files at his home in a spare bedroom that his wife jokingly called Frank's obsession room, where he would spend hours rereading witness statements and studying maps, searching for the pattern he convinced himself was there, hidden in plain sight. The case received periodic attention when new investigative techniques came out. In 1995, the Richmond County Sheriff's Department announced it would review old evidence using newly available DNA analysis methods. Evelyn Holloway's hopes soared, only to crash when investigators explained they had no biological evidence to test. Without a crime scene, without the twins' bodies, without any physical material that might contain genetic information, the revolutionary science that was solving cases across the country had nothing to work with in the Holloway investigation. The turn of the new century brought another review, this time using computer modeling to create probability maps of where the twins might have been taken. FBI analysts put in every known detail, creating scenarios that ranged from kidnapping by a stranger to voluntary departure to tragic accident. The models were sophisticated but ultimately useless without new evidence to test their guesses against reality. Marcus Holloway graduated from Glen Hills High School in 1995, accepted a scholarship to Georgia Southern University, and tried to build a life separate from the tragedy that defined his childhood. But Augusta pulled him back. After earning a degree in criminal justice, he joined the Richmond County Sheriff's Department in 2000, driven by a motivation his academy instructors found both admirable and concerning. Everyone knew why Marcus Holloway wanted to be a law enforcement officer, and everyone wondered if that reason would help or hurt his career. Evelyn continued her watch with unwavering dedication. Every August 14th, she organized a candlelight ceremony at First Baptist Church, drawing crowds that numbered in the hundreds during the early years, shrinking to dozens by the 2000s, eventually becoming a core group of family and the most dedicated friends. She spoke at each ceremony, her voice never wavering, her message never changing. Someone knows what happened to my daughters, and until they speak, I will keep asking. The missing persons posters that Evelyn had printed and distributed in 1990 became historical documents. The twins' faces, forever 15, smiled from yellowed flyers that occasionally turned up in old filing cabinets or between the pages of forgotten books. Age progression images were created in 1995, 2000, 2005, and 2010, showing what Danette and Jeanette might look like as they aged. But these computerized predictions felt hollow to Evelyn, who knew in her heart that her daughters had never gotten the chance to age past that August evening. The Holloway case became part of Augusta's shared memory, a cautionary tale told to each new generation of teenagers about the dangers that could lurk even in familiar places. Parents used it to justify stricter rules and earlier curfews. Teachers talked about it during safety assemblies. The story took on an almost mythical quality, the details softening and changing over time until some younger residents weren't entirely sure if the twins had been real people or urban legend. But they had been real. The evidence of their existence filled Evelyn's house. Photographs documenting their growth from identical infants to gangly middle schoolers, to the poised 15-year-olds who walked out of Morrison's restaurant one last time, report cards showing steady B averages and teacher comments praising their kindness, a shared diary filled with observations about friends and homework and the small dramas that make up teenage life. These artifacts proved that Danette and Jeanette Holloway had lived, had dreams, had futures that were stolen in 18 minutes. The investigation's periodic reviews always reached the same frustrating conclusion. Without new evidence or witness testimony, the case stayed unsolvable. The three original people of interest were re-interviewed multiple times over the years. Marcus Delacqua died in a car accident in 2003. Jerome Williams served time for assault in 2007 but was never charged with anything related to the twins. Robert Chen closed his photography studio in 2010 and moved to Florida, leaving no forwarding address. As 2020 approached, marking 30 years since the disappearance, Evelyn Holloway was 71 years old and in failing health. Diabetes and heart disease, made worse by decades of stress and sleepless nights, had taken their toll. She knew, though she never said it aloud, that time was running out for her to get the answers she had devoted her life to finding. Marcus, now a detective himself in the same department where his mother's case had gone cold, watched his mother's decline with helpless frustration. He had joined law enforcement specifically to help solve his sister's disappearance, but found himself stopped by the same limitations that had stopped the original investigation. No new evidence, no witnesses coming forward, just the same dead ends his predecessors had hit. The 30th anniversary vigil in August 2020 was smaller than usual, COVID-19 restrictions limiting the gathering to immediate family and a handful of faithful friends. Evelyn spoke from a wheelchair, her voice weaker but her message unchanged. Marcus stood beside her, his uniform crisp, his face a mask of professional composure that cracked only when his mother's voice broke on certain words. Daughters, justice, truth. What none of them knew as they stood in the parking lot of First Baptist Church, candles flickering in the hot Georgia night, was that the answer to their decades-long question was closer than they had ever imagined. waiting in a place that had been overlooked simply because it seemed too obvious, too ordinary, too close to the original search area to possibly hold the secret that had avoided them for 30 years. Chapter 4. The Discovery in the Darkness. November 2023 arrived in Augusta with unusual warmth, the kind of fall spring that makes Georgians suspicious of what winter might bring in return. Deputy Sarah Chen, not related to the long-departed photographer Robert Chen, was 26 years old and new enough to the Richmond County Sheriff's Department that she still got assigned the calls no one else wanted: trespassing at abandoned properties, noise complaints, welfare checks on elderly residents who hadn't been seen in days. The call that came through dispatch at 2:15 on the afternoon of November 9th seemed routine enough. A construction crew preparing to tear down an old warehouse on Industrial Boulevard had reported possible human remains discovered during preliminary digging. Chen responded with the tired expectation that she would find animal bones or historical burial sites, something requiring paperwork but not investigation. The warehouse had been part of Augusta's industrial area since the 1950s, a sprawling complex that had housed everything from textile operations to furniture. Manufacturing before falling into disuse in the early 2000s, the building was scheduled for demolition to make way for a mixed-use development, another sign of Augusta's ongoing transformation from its industrial past into something newer and harder to define. Chen arrived to find the construction foreman, a weathered man named Tommy Wade, standing beside a backhoe whose bucket had been frozen mid-lift. Wade's face had the gray color of someone who had seen something they wished they could unsee. He pointed toward a section of exposed earth where the concrete floor had been broken up, revealing what had been hidden beneath for decades. The remains were in a shallow hole that had been covered by the warehouse's original foundation, poured sometime in the 1950s but expanded with additional concrete work in 1990, according to building permits Wade had reviewed. The bones were clearly human, two sets positioned close together, small enough to suggest teenagers or young adults. Scattered among the skeletal remains were pieces of fabric eaten away by time, but keeping hints of denim and cotton, and there, partially buried in the red Georgia clay, two tarnished pieces of jewelry that would transform this discovery from a tragic finding into the answer Augusta had been seeking for 33 years. Chen secured the scene immediately, calling for backup and the medical examiner, while setting up a boundary that kept the construction crew at a distance. Within an hour, the warehouse site had been transformed into a crime scene investigation that would consume the department's resources for weeks. Detective Marcus Holloway, now 46 years old and heading the cold case unit he had essentially created through years of persistent pushing, received the call while reviewing files in his office. The voice on the other end was careful, professional, aware of the weight of what it was about to say. Detective Holloway, we have a situation at the Industrial Boulevard warehouse site. Human remains, possibly two individuals, possibly female, possibly juvenile. And sir, there are two necklaces, matching silver hearts with writing on them. Marcus felt the floor tilt beneath him. He had spent 23 years in law enforcement, 15 of them specifically focused on cold cases, with his sister's disappearance the ghost that haunted every case he worked. He had prepared himself for this moment in theory, had imagined receiving this call countless times, but the reality hit him with physical force that left him momentarily unable to speak. The silver heart necklaces had been birthday gifts from their mother in 1989, each engraved with a twin's name and birth date. Danette's had been on a slightly longer chain to help people tell them apart. Jeanette had complained that the different lengths made her feel like the younger, shorter twin, even though they were identical in height. It was the kind of minor sibling argument that becomes unbearably sad in retrospect. Marcus called his mother before driving to the scene, a conversation that lasted less than 30 seconds because neither of them could trust their voices beyond the essential information. Remains found. Necklaces present waiting for confirmation. He heard her sharp breath, the sound of the phone being set down, the distant sound of crying. Then he was in his vehicle, driving across Augusta toward a warehouse he had passed 1,000 times without knowing it held the answer his family had been seeking since he was 13 years old. The dig site took on the character of an archaeological dig as forensic anthropologists from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation supervised the careful recovery of every bone, every fabric piece, every potential piece of evidence. The warehouse's construction history became crucial evidence. Building permits showed that in August 1990, an emergency concrete pour had been authorized to repair structural problems with the foundation. The contractor listed on the permit was a small local company that had gone out of business in 1997, but archived records revealed the crew foreman's name, Jerome Williams. The name exploded in Marcus's mind like a flashbang grenade. Jerome Williams, one of the original 3 people of interest from 1990, the construction foreman with a history of violence and no alibi for August 14th, the man who had been questioned, given a lie detector test, and ultimately released because suspicion without evidence isn't enough to hold someone, let alone charge them with murder. The forensic examination of the remains proceeded with careful precision. DNA would provide absolute confirmation, but the preliminary assessment already pointed to a conclusion that felt inevitable. 2 female skeletons, approximately 15 years old based on bone development and dental analysis. The positioning suggested they had been placed in the dugout area together, lying side by side, as if arranged with some care rather than simply dumped. Fabric pieces matched the descriptions of clothing the twins had been wearing when they left Morrison's restaurant, denim and cotton that had survived 30 years underground. The breakthrough that had escaped investigators for 33 years came not from the skeletal remains themselves but from the soil analysis that modern forensic science could perform. Samples taken from around the bones contained tiny traces of materials that told a story the bones alone could not. Concrete dust with a chemical makeup matching the emergency pour from August 1990, pollen from plants that bloomed in mid-August in Georgia, and most importantly, traces of a specific type of industrial glue used in construction during that time, a brand that had been stopped in 1995 after concerns about its health effects. Cross-checking purchase records for that glue, still kept in the archives of the manufacturer's successor company, showed that Jerome Williams Construction Company had been one of the main buyers in the Augusta area during 1990. The glue had been used for bonding rebar to concrete and foundation work, exactly the type of work Williams's crew had done at the warehouse in August 1990. The investigation moved forward with a speed that felt almost miraculous after decades of being stuck. Williams, now 61 years old, was located living in a modest apartment on the south side of Augusta, working part-time as a maintenance supervisor at a storage facility. Surveillance watched his routines while investigators built their case, knowing they would have one chance to get this right. The most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Williams' ex-wife, divorced from him since 1998, contacted the tip line after seeing news coverage of the discovery. She had information she said she had been too frightened to reveal 30 years earlier information about her then-husband's behavior in the days following. August 14, 1990, Linda Williams, now Linda Martinez after remarrying, met with Detective Holloway at the Sheriff's Department on November 15th. She was 58 years old, hands shaking as she held a coffee cup, eyes reflecting the weight of carrying a secret for 30 years. Her testimony would provide the human context for the forensic evidence, the why behind the what. He came home that night covered in red clay, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. August 14, 1990. I remember because it was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays he usually finished work by 6 eyes, but that night he didn't get home until almost midnight. His clothes were filthy, not just dirty from regular work, but stained with clay and concrete dust. He told me there had been an emergency at a job site, foundation work that couldn't wait. She paused, gathering courage to continue. The next morning I noticed scratches on his arms, deep ones like fingernail scratches. When I asked about them, he got angry in a way that scared me. He said I needed to mind my own business, that accidents happen on construction sites. I didn't push because Jerry had a temper, and I had learned not to make him angry. Linda's testimony continued, describing her ex-husband's behavior in the weeks following the twins' disappearance. He had become paranoid, obsessed with news coverage, angry when missing person posters appeared around the neighborhood. He had forbidden her from talking to police when they searched the area, claiming they would twist innocent words into accusations. And, most chillingly, he had insisted they attend one of the early vigils for the missing twins, standing in the crowd while Evelyn Holloway begged for information about her daughters. He wanted to see what people were saying. Linda explained. He wanted to know what the police knew. I didn't understand it at the time, or maybe I didn't want to understand it. But after we divorced and I had distance from him, I kept thinking about that night, the clay, the scratches, the paranoia, and I wondered if I had been married to a monster and just couldn't admit it to myself. The evidence was circumstantial, but building into a pattern that felt unbreakable. Jerome Williams had the opportunity, working at the warehouse where the remains were found during the exact time when they were hidden. He had the means, access to equipment and materials needed to hide bodies beneath fresh concrete. And now, thanks to his ex-wife's late testimony, investigators had evidence of guilty behavior, the actions of a man who knew he had done something terrible and was desperately trying to avoid being caught. The arrest warrant was signed on November 18, 2023. Tactical officers surrounded Williams's apartment in the pre-dawn darkness. Marcus Holloway stood in the command vehicle, watching through monitors as the man suspected of murdering his sisters was taken into custody. Williams came out in his bathrobe, confused and angry, demanding to know what this was about until an officer read him his rights and the charges. 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Danette and Jeanette Holloway. The news broke across Augusta like a thunderclap, the revelation that the twins' killer had been identified decades after their disappearance, taking over headlines and leading every local newscast. For a city that had carried this unsolved mystery for 33 years, the arrest felt like both relief and a reopened wound, an answer and an accusation. Chapter 5. The man next door, Jerome Williams, had lived in Augusta his entire life, a fact that made his arrest even more disturbing to a community forced to face how completely a predator can hide himself in the fabric of ordinary life. At 61, Williams looked unremarkable, the kind of man you might pass in a grocery store without a second glance. Average height, weathered face, thinning gray hair, and hands scarred from decades of construction work. Nothing about his appearance suggested he was capable of the violence he was accused of. His neighbors at the apartment complex on Peach Orchard Road expressed the shock that always comes with such revelations. "He helped me carry groceries when my hip was bad," said Eleanor Foster, a 73-year-old widow who lived 2 doors down. "He fixed my leaking faucet last spring and wouldn't take any payment." How do you make sense of that kindness with what they're saying he did? The investigation into Williams's background revealed a pattern that forensic psychologists recognize as typical of violent criminals who successfully avoid being caught for decades. He maintained a surface appearance of normalcy, holding steady jobs, paying his bills on time, avoiding behaviors that would draw law enforcement attention. But beneath that surface lurked a history of violence that had been minimized, excused, or deliberately hidden. The 1988 domestic violence arrest that had appeared in the original investigation had been far more serious than the police report suggested. Medical records obtained through legal order showed that Williams's then-girlfriend had suffered a broken bone around her eye and multiple bruises consistent with being hit repeatedly in the face. She had initially cooperated with prosecutors but withdrew her complaint after Williams was released on bail, later telling a victim advocate that she feared for her life if she testified. The case was dismissed, the records buried, another warning sign that no one had connected to the twins' disappearance 2 years later. Further investigation revealed more incidents that painted a darker picture. A 1986 bar fight where Williams had beaten a man unconscious over something the man said, charges reduced to simple assault through a deal. A 1992 incident where a female co-worker had complained about Williams' inappropriate comments and threatening behavior, resulting in his firing from a construction job but no criminal charges. A 1998 domestic dispute that led to his divorce from Linda, documented in court papers that described a pattern of intimidation and control. Each incident had been treated as separate. The overall pattern was never put together into a clear warning about Williams's capacity for violence against women. The system had failed not through dramatic oversight but through the ordinary reality that information doesn't automatically connect across different places, different times, different agencies. The search of Williams' apartment, done with careful thoroughness, found evidence that would prove crucial in court. In a storage unit Williams rented under a false name, investigators discovered a box containing newspaper clippings about the Holloway twins' disappearance, including several front-page articles from August and September 1990. The clippings had been kept carefully, protected in plastic sleeves organized by date. It was the collection of someone obsessed with his own crime. Someone who got satisfaction from reliving it through media coverage. Also in the storage unit was a work journal Williams had kept during his construction years, recording jobs and materials and crew assignments. The entry for August 14, 1990 was notable because it was missing. The pages jumped from August 13th to August 15th, with the 14th apparently torn out. But forensic document examiners looking at the journal under special lighting could read the impression of writing that had pressed through from the missing page onto the one beneath it. The words were partial but devastating. Warehouse and foundation, emergency pour, and most chillingly, no one will know. The forensic evidence from the warehouse site provided the scientific certainty that would eliminate reasonable doubt. DNA taken from bone marrow confirmed the remains were those of Danette and Jeanette Holloway, ending any slim possibility that the discovery might be a coincidence. The microscopic trace evidence, the industrial glue, the concrete composition, the pollen profile, all supported the conclusion that the twins had been buried at the warehouse in August 1990 during the emergency foundation work that Jerome Williams had supervised. The medical examiner's analysis of the skeletal remains revealed cause of death: blunt force trauma to the skulls consistent with a heavy object striking from behind. The twins had been attacked from the back, given no chance to defend themselves or run away. The fracture pattern suggested a single powerful blow to each victim, delivered with the kind of force that comes from rage or determination or both. Reconstruction of the crime became possible through the combination of forensic evidence and Linda Williams' testimony. Investigators theorized that Jerome Williams, who had been a regular at Morrison's restaurant and had noticed the twins during their shifts, had followed them when they left work on August 14th. The dark car witnesses had seen sitting near the corner of Broad and Hickman was Williams's black Ford Taurus. He had stopped the twins along their route home, possibly offering a ride as storm clouds gathered overhead, possibly simply forcing them into his vehicle. Why he had targeted them specifically remained unknown. Perhaps they had rejected his attention at the restaurant. Perhaps they simply represented opportunity, young and vulnerable and following a predictable route. The psychology of predatory violence rarely offers satisfying explanations for the unexplainable. What was clear was that Williams had taken the twins to the warehouse where his crew was working, a location he controlled and could access after hours. He had killed them there, then used his position as construction foreman to arrange the emergency foundation pour that would hide their bodies beneath fresh concrete. The next day, he had shown up at the job site with his crew, supervising the work that sealed his crime beneath tons of concrete and decades of silence. For 33 years, Williams had lived with this secret, attending vigils for the victims, watching their mother's public grief, observing law enforcement's frustration, knowing exactly where the twins were buried while the entire community searched in vain. Psychological evaluations ordered by the court would describe him as having narcissistic and antisocial personality traits, someone capable of doing terrible acts without experiencing normal empathy or remorse. The community's reaction to Williams' arrest evolved from shock to a shared examination of missed opportunities and ignored warning signs. How many people had interacted with him over 30 years, never suspecting his guilt? How many times had he driven past the warehouse that held his victims, secure in the belief that his secret was perfectly kept? For Marcus Holloway, facing his sister's killer required a professional distance that fought against 33 years of built-up grief and rage. He interviewed Williams 3 times before the trial, seeking answers to questions that had tormented his family for decades. Williams said little, maintaining his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence, offering no explanation and no apology. In one particularly tense interview, Marcus asked directly, "Why them? Why my sisters?" Williams met his gaze with empty eyes and replied, "I don't know what you're talking about." It was the response of a man who had spent 30 years building a wall between his crime and his conscience, brick by brick, until he could genuinely believe his own denials. The arrest of Jerome Williams marked the transformation of the Holloway case from unsolved mystery to case ready for trial. But it also marked something else, the moment when a family's 33-year wait for answers finally, impossibly, came to an end. Chapter 6. Justice Delayed. The trial of Jerome Williams began on March 4, 2024, in the Richmond County Superior Court, drawing media attention from across Georgia and beyond. The courtroom's oak-paneled walls and high ceiling gave weight to proceedings that felt less like a legal procedure and more like a ritual of shared reckoning. Augusta had waited 33 years for this moment, and the gallery filled with spectators reflected that long buildup of grief, rage, and desperate need for closure. Evelyn Holloway, now 74 and visibly frail, was wheeled into the courtroom by Marcus each morning of the trial. She wore the same navy blue dress every day, the one she had worn to the twins' 15th birthday party 2 months before they vanished. Her hands shook in her lap, but her eyes stayed fixed on Jerome Williams with an intensity that made court observers uncomfortable. She had waited more than half her life for this moment, and nothing, not failing health or emotional exhaustion, would keep her from witnessing every second. District Attorney Patricia Morrison, not related to the detective who had worked the original case, presented the prosecution's evidence with careful precision. She was 51 years old, a veteran of high-profile cases, but she later told reporters that the Holloway trial affected her more deeply than any case in her 26-year career. The jury saw crime scene photographs of the warehouse dig, the skeletal remains positioned side by side, the tarnished heart necklaces that had survived 30 years underground. They heard from forensic anthropologists who explained how bone analysis revealed the twins' age and cause of death. They looked at evidence bags containing fabric pieces and soil samples, the scientific proof that turned theory into certainty. Linda Williams took the stand on the 4th day of testimony. Her voice steady despite obvious nervousness. She told about that August night in 1990 when her then-husband had come home covered in red clay and concrete dust, the scratches on his arms, his paranoid behavior in the weeks that followed. Defense attorney Robert Kramer tried to discredit her testimony, suggesting that a bitter divorce had motivated her to make up accusations against her ex-husband, but Linda's response silenced the courtroom. "I've carried this for 33 years, she said, tears streaming down her face. I was too scared to speak when it mattered, and 2 families paid the price for my cowardice. I can't undo that, but I can tell the truth now and live with whatever comes from it." The forensic evidence proved overwhelming. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a trace evidence specialist from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, testified about the industrial glue found in soil samples from the burial site. She explained how this particular brand had been stopped in 1995, making it possible to narrow the timeline and identify buyers. The records showing Williams Construction Company as a main buyer were entered into evidence, along with invoices bearing his signature. The prosecution's star witness was Detective Frank Morrison, the original lead investigator who had retired in 1998 but had never stopped thinking about the Holloway twins. Now 78 years old and walking with a cane, Morrison took the stand and provided context that only someone who had lived with the case for decades could offer. He described the 1990 investigation, the 3 people of interest including Williams, the frustration of having suspicions but no evidence. His testimony carried the weight of professional regret, the knowledge that if forensic technology had been more advanced, if investigative resources had been more plentiful, if just one piece of evidence had been discovered earlier, perhaps the twins' families wouldn't have suffered 33 years of uncertainty. "I interviewed Jerome Williams 4 times in 1990, Morrison testified, his voice heavy with emotion. He was nervous, defensive, but that could describe any number of people we questioned. We had no physical evidence connecting him to the twins. We had no witnesses placing him with them. All we had was gut instinct, and gut instinct isn't enough to arrest someone, let alone convict them." The defense's strategy focused on how much time had passed and whether decades-old memories could be trusted. Kramer argued that Linda Williams's testimony was tainted by years of anger following a difficult divorce. He challenged the forensic evidence, suggesting that trace materials could have been introduced through contamination or chance. He emphasized that Williams had no prior convictions for violent crimes, a claim that ignored the pattern of violence documented in arrest reports and witness statements. Williams himself chose not to testify, a decision that surprised no one who had watched his attitude throughout the trial. He sat at the defense table with an expression of studied indifference, occasionally leaning to whisper to his attorney but showing no visible reaction to even the most damning testimony. Psychological experts would later describe this as consistent with antisocial personality disorder, the inability to connect emotionally with the suffering his actions had caused. The most powerful moment of the trial came when Marcus Holloway testified, not as the investigating detective but as a victim impact witness. He spoke about growing up in the shadow of his sister's disappearance, watching his mother's life consumed by the search for answers, choosing a law enforcement career driven by the need to understand what had happened to Danette and Jeanette. His voice broke only once when describing the moment he received the call about the remains discovered at the warehouse. For 33 years, I've lived with two competing needs, Marcus said, facing the jury directly. The need to hope that my sisters might somehow still be alive and the need to know the truth even if it destroyed that hope. Finding them gave us truth but took away the last bit of possibility that this story might have a different ending. Justice can't bring back what was taken from us, but it can acknowledge that their lives mattered, and their deaths demand accountability. The jury thought for 7 hours before reaching their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman, a retired teacher named Dorothy Ellis, stood to deliver the decision that would close a chapter in Augusta's history that had stayed open for more than 30 years. We, the jury, find the defendant Jerome Williams guilty of murder in the first degree in the death of Danette Holloway. The words seemed to echo in the stillness that followed. Then, we, the jury, find the defendant Jerome Williams guilty of murder in the first degree in the death of Jeanette Holloway. Evelyn Holloway collapsed into tears, her body shaking with sobs that represented not just relief, but the release of 33 years of built-up grief. Marcus held her, his own tears falling silently as the courtroom erupted in reaction. Some spectators wept, others hugged. A few called out words of thanks to the jury. Judge Catherine Reynolds had to restore order with her gavel, though she made no effort to hide her own emotional response to the verdict. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Georgia law required life imprisonment for murder in the first degree, but Judge Reynolds had choice regarding the possibility of parole. She took 20 minutes to explain her reasoning before announcing that Jerome Williams would serve 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would die in prison. Mr. Williams, you robbed 2 young women of their futures, Reynolds said, her voice steady but edged with steel. You robbed their family of 33 years that could have been spent healing instead of searching. You robbed this community of its sense of safety and trust. The law allows for mercy in appropriate circumstances, but I find none here. You will spend whatever remains of your life thinking about the enormity of what you've done, though I suspect you lack the capacity for genuine remorse. William showed no reaction to the sentence, keeping the same empty expression he had worn throughout the trial. As officers led him from the courtroom in chains, he didn't look back at the gallery where Evelyn Holloway sat, the mother whose daughters he had killed and whose life he had devastated. The conviction brought closure of a sort, but closure is never as simple as justice served. Evelyn lived just long enough to see William sentenced, passing away peacefully in her sleep 3 months later in June 2024. Marcus found her in the morning, still in the chair by the window where she had kept her decades-long watch. On her lap was a photograph of the twins at age 10, arms around each other, identical smiles suggesting a future full of promise. The funeral drew hundreds of mourners who had followed the Holloway case for decades. Tributes focused not just on Evelyn's loss but on her unwavering determination, her refusal to let her daughters be forgotten, her transformation of personal tragedy into advocacy that had helped other families navigate similar ordeals. The missing persons support group she had founded continued its monthly meetings, now led by others who understood the particular pain of waiting without answers. Marcus inherited his mother's house and faced the difficult task of deciding what to do with the bedroom his sisters had shared, kept exactly as they had left it in 1990. He ultimately donated the twins' belongings to the Georgia Cold Case Archive, a place established to keep evidence and memories of victims whose cases had finally been solved. The archive would ensure that Danette and Jeanette Holloway were remembered not just as victims but as individuals, whose lives had value beyond their tragic end. The city of Augusta responded to the case's resolution with both relief and self-examination. The empty lot where the warehouse had stood was turned into a memorial park, dedicated to missing persons, with a granite monument bearing the twins' names and the simple inscription, "Gone but never forgotten, found but never replaced." The park included a walking path lined with trees, each sponsored by families of missing persons from across Georgia, creating a living memorial that would grow and change with the seasons. The Richmond County Sheriff's Department established the Holloway Cold Case Initiative, committing resources to reviewing unsolved missing persons cases using modern forensic techniques. The program was funded through a combination of state grants and private donations, many from Augusta residents who had followed the twins' case and wanted to ensure other families might get answers without waiting 33 years. Marcus continued his work in law enforcement, now recognized as an expert in cold case investigation. He gave talks at the Georgia Public Safety Training Center, teaching younger officers that persistence matters, that cases are never truly cold. As long as someone refuses to forget, that advances in forensic science mean today's impossible case might be tomorrow's solved mystery. Jerome Williams died in prison in November 2025, less than 2 years after his conviction. A heart attack took him in his sleep, denying victims' families the satisfaction of seeing him serve decades behind bars, but ensuring he never experienced freedom again. Marcus attended the notification meeting when the prison informed next of kin of Williams' death, finding himself surprised by his own lack of reaction. The man who had haunted his family for 33 years had become, in the end, just another number in the prison system. The Holloway case became a teaching tool in criminal justice programs across the country, showing how cases can be solved decades after they happen when persistent investigation combines with evolving forensic technology. It appeared in textbooks and documentaries, transformed from a specific tragedy into a symbol of hope for families still waiting for answers. But for those who had lived through it, who had known Danette and Jeanette as real people rather than case studies, the resolution brought complicated emotions. Gladys Morrison, who had taught both twins in middle school, perhaps expressed it best at the Memorial Park dedication. "We got justice, and that matters," she said, her voice carrying across the gathering. "But justice can't give us back what we lost." Two bright, kind, funny girls who should have grown up to be teachers or doctors or mothers or anything they wanted to be. Justice says their lives mattered. It doesn't say their deaths make sense. On warm August evenings, when the humidity hangs heavy and fireflies dance above the grass, people sometimes gather at the Memorial Park to remember. They bring flowers. They light candles. They tell stories about the twins who vanished one summer night in 1990 and were finally found 33 years later, buried beneath concrete but never erased from memory. The case proved that time doesn't heal all wounds but can't prevent truth from eventually coming out. It showed that justice delayed is still justice, that families' refusal to forget can outlast killers' belief that they've gotten away with their crimes, that science and persistence can combine to give voice to victims who were silenced but never truly lost. Danette and Jeanette Holloway remain forever 15 in photographs and memories, but their legacy extends beyond their brief lives. They taught a community that the search for truth requires patience and determination. They showed that ordinary people, mothers, who won't stop searching, brothers who become detectives, can accomplish what seems impossible. And they proved that some lights, once put out, can still shine in the darkness if enough people refuse to let them be forgotten. The sun sets over Augusta now as it did in August 1990, painting the sky in those same shades of peach and purple. But the city is different, marked by the knowledge that justice can come even after 33 years of waiting, that answers exist even when they seem impossibly distant, and that the simple act of refusing to forget can transform tragedy into something that helps others find their way home.